Bueno, quiero enviar un cordial saludo a todos los estudiantes que están viendo este video. En esta videoclase se va a abordar el tema de la geopolítica a nivel mundial. Vamos a pasar dos videos que son muy interesantes. Uno que se llama la geopolítica de la Tercera Guerra Mundial, que básicamente lo que hace es explicar cómo han sido las dinámicas y las tensiones geopolíticas desde hace unas décadas para acá a nivel mundial. Y sobre todo con el surgimiento de actores tales como Rusia, como China, como nuevos actores, digamos así, importantes en la geopolítica mundial actual, pero también mostrando como los antecedentes de cómo han sido esas dinámicas que se han dado desde la década de los 70s, la pugna del dólar como moneda internacional y cómo, digámoslo así, aquellos gobiernos que de una u otra forma desafiaron el poder del dólar a nivel, digámoslo así, en la economía internacional, pues digamos que asumieron unas consecuencias bastante fuertes y tuvieron que enfrentarse pues digámoslo así, al poderío militar norteamericano. Entonces ese es un primer video y vamos a ver un segundo video que lo que hace es explicar, hacer como un análisis proyectivo de cómo se espera que se va a desarrollar el escenario geopolítico mundial tras la pandemia del COVID-19. Entonces ahí se hace como un análisis un poco pues especulativo acerca de quiénes podrán ser los próximos protagonistas dentro de la escena política mundial, cuáles van a ser los intereses geopolíticos que se van a desarrollar tras esta pandemia. Entonces pues básicamente esos son los dos videitos que vamos a abordar y que vamos a trabajar. Entonces antes de empezar recuerde que pues el trabajo me lo tiene que enviar a este correo y que las preguntas a resolver están aquí abajo en la descripción del video. Entonces sin más preámbulo, bienvenidos.
We have, as you say, ISIS, Islamic State at the heart of the Middle East, Iran going nuclear, Russia on the move, China claiming territory that it doesn't really have a right to.
Reports by the day that show Russian troops are going further into southeastern Ukraine and helping turn the tide.
Can they be defeated without addressing that part of their organization which resides in Syria? The answer is no.
We're actively considering what's going to be necessary to deal with that threat, and we're not going to be restricted by borders.
Airstrikes, bomb them, keep bombing them again and again.
You don't have history, it's as if you were born yesterday. If you're born yesterday, you'll believe whatever anybody in authority tells you. You have no way of checking up on it. But with a little history, you might become dubious. With a little history, it doesn't prove that the government is lying to you today. It just asks you to inquire if it is.
Contrary to popular belief, conduct of nations on the international stage is almost never driven by moral considerations, but rather by a shadowy cocktail of money and geopolitics. As such, when you see the mouthpieces of the ruling class begin to demonize a foreign country, the first question on your mind should always be, what is actually at stake here? For some time now, Russia, China, Iran, and Syria have been in the crosshairs. Once you understand why, the events unfolding in the world right now will make much more sense. The US dollar is a truly unique currency. In fact, its current design and its relationship to geopolitics is unlike any other in history. Though it has been the world reserve currency since 1945, this is not what makes it unique. Many currencies have held their reserve status off and on over the centuries. But what makes the dollar unique is the fact that since the early 1970s it has been, with a few notable exceptions, the only currency used to buy and sell oil on the global market. Prior to 1971, the US dollar was bound to the gold standard, at least officially. According to the IMF, by 1966 foreign central banks held $14 billion in US dollars. However, the United States only had $3.2 billion in gold allocated to cover foreign holdings. Translation, the Federal Reserve was printing more money than it could actually back. The result was rampant inflation and a general flight from the dollar. In 1971, in what later came to be called the Nixon shock, President Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard completely.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
At this point, the dollar became a pure debt-based currency. With debt-based currencies, money is literally loaned into existence. approximately 70% of the money in circulation is created by ordinary banks, which are allowed to loan out more money than they actually have in their accounts. The rest is created by the Federal Reserve, which loans out money that they don't have, mostly to government. It's kind of like writing hot checks, except it's legal for banks. This practice, which is referred to as fractional reserve banking, is supposedly regulated by the Federal Reserve, an institution which just happens to be owned and controlled by a conglomerate of banks. And no agency or branch of government regulates the Federal Reserve.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
Now, to make things even more interesting, these fractional reserve loans have interest attached, but the money to pay that interest doesn't exist in the system. As a result, there's always more total debt than there is money in circulation. And in order to stay afloat, the economy must grow perpetually. This is obviously not sustainable. Now, you might be wondering how the dollar has maintained such a dominant position on the world stage for over 40 years, if it's really little more than an elaborate Ponzi scheme. Well, this is where the dollar meets geopolitics. In 1973, under the shadow of the artificial OPEC crisis, the Nixon administration began secret negotiations with the government of Saudi Arabia to establish what later came to be referred to as the petrodollar recycling system. Under the arrangement, Saudis would only sell their oil in US dollars. It would invest the majority of their excess profits into US banks and capital markets. The IMF would then use this money to facilitate loans to oil importers who were having difficulties covering the increase in oil prices. The interest and payments on these loans would of course be denominated in US dollars. This agreement was formalized in the US-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, put together by Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, in 1974. The system was expanded to include the rest of OPEC by 1975. Though presented as a buffer to the recessionary effects of rising oil prices, this arrangement had a hidden side effect. It removed the traditional restraints on US monetary policy. The Federal Reserve was now free to increase the money supply at will. The ever-increasing demand for oil would prevent a flight from the dollar, while distributing the inflationary consequences across the entire planet. The dollar went from being a gold-backed currency to an oil-backed currency. It also became America's primary export. Did you ever wonder how the US economy has been able to stay afloat while running multi-billion-dollar trade deficits for decades? Did you ever wonder how it is that the US holds such a disproportionate amount of the world's wealth when 70% of the US economy is consumer-based? In the modern era, fossil fuels make the world go round. They have become integrated into every aspect of civilization. Agriculture, transportation, plastics, heating, defense, medicine, and demand just keeps growing. As long as the world needs oil, and as long as oil is only sold in US dollars, there will be a demand for US dollars. And that demand is what gives the dollar its value. For the United States, this is a great deal. Dollars go out, either as paper or digits in a computer system, and real, tangible products and services come in. However, for the rest of the world, it's a very sneaky form of exploitation. Having global trade predominantly in dollars also provides Washington with a powerful financial weapon through sanctions. This is due to the fact that most large-scale dollar transactions are forced to pass through the US. This petrodollar system stood unchallenged until September of 2000, when Saddam Hussein announced his decision to switch Iraq's oil sales off of the dollar to euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar, and easily the most important geopolitical event of the year. But only one article in the Western media even mentioned it. In the same month that Saddam announced he was moving away from the dollar, an organization called the Project for a New American Century, of which Dick Cheney just happened to be a member, released a document entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. This document called for massive increases in US military spending and a much more aggressive foreign policy in order to expand US dominance worldwide. However, the document lamented that achieving these goals would take many years, quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, end quote. 1 year later, they got it. Riding the emotional reaction to 9/11, the Bush administration was able to invade Afghanistan and Iraq and pass the Patriot Act, all without any significant resistance.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq? Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And this wasn't a question of bad intelligence. This was a cold, calculated lie. And the decision to invade was made in full knowledge of the disaster that would follow.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq, the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds, and if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you've threatened the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take it down Iraq.
They knew exactly what was going to happen. But in 2003, they did it anyway. Once Iraqi oil fields were under U.S. control, oil sales were immediately switched back to the dollar. Mission accomplished. Soon after the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration attempted to extend these wars to Iran. Supposedly, the Iranian government was working to build a nuclear weapon. After the Iraq fiasco, Washington's credibility was severely damaged. As a result, they were unable to muster international or domestic support for an intervention. Their efforts were further sabotaged by elements within the CIA and Mossad, who came forward to state that Iran had not even made the decision to develop nuclear weapons, much less begin an attempt. However, the demonization campaign against Iran continued, even into the Obama administration. Why? Well, might it have something to do with the fact that since 2004, Iran has been in the process of organizing an independent oil bourse? The Iranians were building their own oil market, and it wasn't going to be tied to the dollar. The first shipments of oil were sold through this market in July of 2011. Unable to get the war that they wanted, the US used the UN to impose sanctions against Iran. The goal of the sanctions was to topple the Iranian regime. While this did inflict damage on the Iranian economy, the measures failed to destabilize the country. This was due in large part to Russia's assistance in bypassing US banking restrictions. In February of 2009, Muammar Gaddafi was named chairman of the African Union. He immediately proposed the formation of a unified state with a single currency. It was the nature of that proposed currency that got him killed. In March of 2009, the African Union released a document entitled Towards a Single African Currency. Pages 106 and 107 of that document specifically discuss the benefits and technicalities of running the African Central Bank under a gold standard. On page 94, it explicitly states that the key to the success of the African Monetary Union would be the, quote, eventual linking of a single African currency to the most monetary of all commodities, gold. In 2011, the CIA moved into Libya and began backing militant groups in their campaign to topple Gaddafi, and the US and NATO pushed through and stretched a UN no-fly zone resolution to tip the balance with airstrikes. presence of al-Qaeda extremists among these rebel fighters was swept under the rug. Libya, like Iran and Iraq, had committed the unforgivable crime of challenging the US dollar. The NATO intervention in Libya segued into a covert war on Syria. The armories of the Libyan government were looted, and the weapons were shipped via Turkey to Syrian rebels working to topple Assad. It was already clear at this point that a large percentage of these fighters had ties to terrorist organizations. However, the US national security apparatus viewed this as a necessary evil. In fact, the Council on Foreign Relations published an article in 2012 stating that, quote, "The influx of jihadis brings discipline, religious fervor, battle experience from Iraq, funding from Sunni sympathizers in the Gulf, and most importantly, deadly results. In short, the FSA needs al-Qaeda now." End quote. In 2013, these same al-Qaeda-linked Syrian rebels launched 2 sarin gas attacks. This was an attempt to frame Assad and muster international support for military intervention. Fortunately, they were exposed by UN and Russian investigators, and the push for airstrikes completely fell apart when Russia stepped in to broker a diplomatic solution. The campaign for regime change in Syria, as in Libya, has been presented in terms of human rights. Obviously, this isn't the real motive. In 2009, Qatar put forth a proposal to run a natural gas pipeline through Syria and Turkey to Europe. Assad, however, rejected this. And in 2011, he forged a pact with Iraq and Iran to build a pipeline eastward, cutting Qatar and Saudi Arabia out of the loop completely. Not surprisingly, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey have been the most aggressive regional players in the push to topple the Syrian government. But why would this pipeline dispute put Syria in Washington's crosshairs? 3 reasons. 1. This pipeline arrangement would significantly strengthen Iran's position, allowing them to export to European markets without having to pass through any of Washington's allies. This obviously reduces the US government's leverage. 2. Syria is Iran's closest ally. Its collapse would inherently weaken Iran. And 3. Syria and Iran have a mutual defense agreement. A US intervention in Syria could open the door to open conflict with Iran. In February of 2014, this global chess game heated up in a new venue, Ukraine. The real target, however, was Russia. You see, Russia just happens to be the world's 2nd largest oil exporter. And not only have they been a thorn in Washington's side diplomatically, but they also opened up an energy bourse in 2008 with sales denominated in rubles and gold. Russia has also been in the process of organizing a Eurasian Economic Union, which includes plans to adopt a common currency unit and which is slated to have its own independent energy market. Leading up to the crisis, Ukraine had been presented with a choice: either join the EU under an association agreement or join the Eurasian Union. The EU insisted that this was an either-or proposition. Ukraine couldn't join both. Russia, on the other hand, asserted that joining both posed no issue. President Yanukovych decided to go with Russia. In response, the US national security apparatus did what it does best. It toppled Yanukovych and installed a puppet government. To see the full evidence of Washington's involvement in the coup, watch the Ukraine crisis, which you're not being told. Though this all seemed to be going well at first, the US quickly lost control of the situation. Crimea held a referendum, and the people voted overwhelmingly to secede from Ukraine and reunify with Russia. The transition was orderly and peaceful. No one was killed. Yet the West immediately framed the entire event as an act of Russian aggression. And this became the go-to mantra from that point on. Crimea is important geostrategically because of its position in the Black Sea, which allows for the projection of naval power into the Mediterranean. Now, the US has been pushing for Ukraine's inclusion into NATO for years now. Such a move would place US forces right on Russia's border, and could have potentially resulted in Russia losing their naval base in Crimea. This is why Russia immediately accepted the results of the Crimean referendum and quickly consolidated the territory. Meanwhile, in eastern Ukraine, 2 regions declared independence from Kiev and held referendums of their own, the results of which overwhelmingly favored self-rule. Kiev responded to this with what they referred to as anti-terrorist operations. In practice, this was a massive and indiscriminate shelling campaign which killed thousands of civilians. Apparently, killing civilians didn't qualify as aggression to the West. In fact, the IMF explicitly warned the provisional government that their $17 billion loan package could be in danger if they were not able to put down the uprising in eastern Ukraine. While the war against eastern Ukraine was raging, elections were held and Petro Poroshenko was elected president. Turns out that Poroshenko was exposed by a leaked diplomatic cable released by WikiLeaks in 2008 as having worked as a mole for the US State Department since 2006. They referred to him as our Ukraine insider, and much of the cable referred to information that he was providing. Having a puppet in place, however, hasn't turned out to be enough to give Washington the upper hand in this crisis. What does Washington do when they have no other leverage? They impose sanctions, they demonize, and they saber rattle. This isn't a very good strategy when dealing with Russia. In fact, it's already backfired. Sanctions have merely pushed Russia and China into closer cooperation and have accelerated Russia's de-dollarization agenda. And in spite of the rhetoric, this has not led to Russia being isolated. The US and NATO have put a wedge between themselves and Russia, but not between Russia and the rest of the world. This new anti-dollar axis goes deeper than economics. These countries understand what's at stake here. This is why in the wake of the Ukrainian crisis, China has proposed a new Eurasian Security Pact, which would include Russia and Iran. Consider the implications here as the Obama administration begins bombing in Syria, which also has a mutual defense agreement with Iran. This is not the Cold War 2.0. This is World War 3.0. The masses may not have figured it out yet, but history will remember it that way. Alliances are solidifying and hot wars are underway on multiple fronts. If the provocations and proxy wars continue, it's only a matter of time before the big players confront each other directly, and that is a recipe for disaster. Does all of this sound insane to you? Oh, you're right. The people running the world right now are insane, and the public is sleepwalking into a tragedy. If you want to alter the course that we are on, there's only one way to do it. We have to wake up that public. Even the most powerful weapons of war are neutralized if you reach the mind of the man behind the trigger. How do we wake the masses, you ask? Don't wait for someone else to answer that for you. Get creative. Act like your children's and grandchildren's futures depend on it. Because they do.
Gracias por las preguntas. ¿Qué nuevo orden político y económico nos va a dejar esta pandemia? Pues muchas incógnitas y alguna certeza. Así que mejor centrarnos primero en las certezas. El poder global va a desplazarse de este a oeste, mayormente, pero no solo, de Estados Unidos a China. Hay quien perciba este desplazamiento de poder como un mayor equilibrio global y lo celebre, y hay quien lo perciba como una mayor amenaza y lo lamente. En cualquier caso, las rivalidades de poder existentes antes de COVID-19 van a verse agudizadas tras esta pandemia. Asistiremos a un mundo más volátil. Ahondemos en esta rivalidad entre Estados Unidos y China por ser el poder dominador, porque va a ser el desencadenante de otros cambios. Primero, entendamos que este virus no es la causa de las difíciles relaciones entre Estados Unidos y China. El origen en China del coronavirus es el argumento electoral de Donald Trump para su próxima campaña electoral. Y sí, está exacerbando las fricciones existentes.
All I can say is wherever it came from China, in whatever form.
Incluso en medio de la epidemia, el ruido de sables ya se está oyendo en el mar del sur de China entre las dos naciones. Pero las malas relaciones entre ambos países son crónicas, vienen de lejos. Es una lucha por el poder económico. Atrás queda el superficial acuerdo comercial de primera fase firmado el pasado enero. Y lo que tenemos ahora es un daño que va a ser difícil reparar. Asistimos a una guerra abierta de desinformación por ambas partes. China ha tratado de negar la responsabilidad del virus que se originó en su país al difundir teorías de confusión y conspiración. Y los Estados Unidos han respondido tratando de culpar a China con la designación de virus de Wuhan o virus chino, en referencia a donde se identificó por primera vez la enfermedad. El secretario de Estado de Estados Unidos, Mike Pompeo, insiste en que China debe ser responsable de la propagación mundial del virus.
I can tell you that there is a significant amount of evidence that this came from that laboratory in Wuhan.
La guerra de propaganda de Estados Unidos no solo es un intento de distraer la atención de la mala gestión de su administración en la primera fase de la pandemia. También tiene como objetivo el intentar mostrarnos a la opinión pública internacional su superioridad moral sobre China en términos de apertura y transparencia de su gobierno. China, que también se da cuenta de la importancia de tener la opinión pública internacional de su lado, está realizando un esfuerzo concertado para compartir información científica y asesoramiento médico, y para ofrecer asistencia a los países que luchan contra la pandemia en todo el mundo.
We should have actually expressed our respect and gratitude to China for what it's doing.
A su favor también tiene la eficiencia mostrada para contener el virus en su población, en contraste con el mal manejo de la enfermedad de muchos estados democráticos occidentales, entre ellos los Estados Unidos de América. Mirando este gráfico sobre la predicción del Producto Interior Bruto de varios países, expresado en trimestres, parece probable que China dentro de un par de años ya esté por un 10% de crecimiento, mientras que muchos otros países aún estemos recuperando el crecimiento en territorio negativo. China va a ser la primera en salir de la crisis y quien lidere el camino hacia la recuperación. Dirigirá todos sus recursos para impulsar su economía y aunque enfrenta desafíos como la deuda sustancial que acarrea y la débil demanda mundial que encontrará, sus ventajas subyacentes en términos de fuerte inversión, innovación y crecimiento de la productividad la van a impulsar hacia adelante, no solo a ella, sino a otras economías de rápido crecimiento en Asia. Ya decimos, el poder económico mundial se desplazará hacia Oriente en los próximos años. Estados Unidos y Europa se revolverán contra esta situación, pero poco van a poder hacer por evitarla. La hegemonía tecnológica china ya es innegable. China es el líder de las industrias farmoquímica, automotriz, aeronáutica, electrónica y telecomunicaciones. Se mantiene al frente en la construcción de redes 5G, en inteligencia artificial, computación cuántica y superordenadores. China posee casi la mitad de los 500 mejores superordenadores del mundo y produce el 30% de la energía solar del planeta. Los países desarrollados podrían dañar en parte la demanda de productos chinos como resultado de revisar su dependencia de China para obtener productos vitales y de tomar medidas para diversificar sus líneas de suministro y aumentar la capacidad de recuperación nacional. Occidente buscará una mayor autosuficiencia nacional y una menor dependencia de China, pero la restitución y localización de la producción va a tener límites económicos y políticos y va a llevar tiempo liberarse de los productos y redes de distribución chinos, tiempo en el que China cogerá más ventaja. Ya mismo la está aprovechando para aumentar su perfil global y demostrar su importancia como un actor global indispensable. China provee ahora experiencia y apoyo a los países afectados por la pandemia. Podría darse el caso de que China añadiese a su propuesta Nueva Ruta de la Seda una iniciativa sanitaria en algunos países africanos, tanto para reforzar su reputación en el escenario global como para proteger sus inversiones allí. Algunos de estos países africanos se convertirán en campos de batalla para el desarrollo de rivalidades y conflictos de gran poder. Pero lo que todo esto nos va a mostrar a las claras es una situación ya existente pero no muy conocida. El inmenso área de influencia de China ya establecido en partes de África, Europa Oriental, América Latina y el sudeste asiático. No vamos a desestimar el poder de los Estados Unidos, especialmente militar, pero su liderazgo global continuará disminuyendo. Ya lo ha venido haciendo en los últimos 3 años desde que Trump instaurase su política de Estados Unidos primero y se retirase de algunas regiones que tenía bajo su influencia. En el proceso, muchos países han llegado a ver a los Estados Unidos como un socio menos confiado y confiable. China va llenando algunos de los vacíos que Estados Unidos va dejando. Otros poderes regionales llevan ya tiempo intentando capitalizar en esta progresiva fragmentación del orden global. Es el caso de Rusia, Turquía e Irán. Para algunos de estos estados, la epidemia representa una oportunidad para reforzar su presencia regional y global y restituir su liderazgo en sus patios traseros. Aunque los recientes brotes de coronavirus en Rusia y Turquía van a limitar su capacidad de extender ese liderazgo a corto plazo. La Unión Europea va a salir más debilitada de esta crisis de lo que ya está. Después de la crisis de la deuda soberana, la crisis migratoria y el Brexit, la crisis del coronavirus causará aún más daño. La Unión Europea ni confía en Estados Unidos ni confía en China, de quien declaró que es un rival sistémico y un competidor estratégico. Algunos líderes europeos están pidiendo una política exterior y de defensa europea común más ambiciosa, pero la pandemia ha expuesto las desavenencias entre los países miembros al ser incapaces de movilizar una respuesta conjunta a esta crisis pandémica. Los países europeos han actuado unilateralmente, cerrando fronteras, suspendiendo la libre circulación y deteniendo los enlaces de transporte sin coordinación. El caso de Italia fue vergonzoso y revelador. Cuando Italia, el primer país en ser duramente castigado por el coronavirus, pidió asistencia, fue inicialmente ignorado por otros estados europeos que también bloquearon las exportaciones de suministros y equipos médicos, lo que permitió a China intervenir para ofrecer ayuda. Hasta Rusia ha enviado ayuda militar y médica a Italia en aviones marcados desde Rusia con amor. Y dicho sea de paso, Rusia también ha enviado un avión lleno de máscaras y suministros médicos a los Estados Unidos. Un indicativo de que la epidemia representa una oportunidad para algunos de reforzar su presencia regional y global. En Europa hay divisiones enconadas entre países del norte y del sur, y entre el este y el oeste del continente. Tanto políticamente como económicamente, la Unión Europea perderá influencia global tras la pandemia. A largo plazo, la pandemia acelerará la fragmentación y la descomposición del orden mundial global en beneficio de potencias emergentes como China y potencialmente de Rusia y Turquía. El reto para la mayoría de los países será escoger con quién van a aliarse en la creciente rivalidad de poder que tenemos por delante. Y por ahí es por donde aparecen las muchas incógnitas que dijimos al comienzo se presentan. Por ejemplo, el futuro de la Unión Europea y de América Latina con el auge de los fascismos, no solo a nivel de partidos, sino a nivel social, expresado en un mayor rechazo hacia los movimientos migratorios. La creciente desconfianza en la utilidad de las democracias y sociedades políticamente más fracturadas puede resultar en mayor pérdida de libertades y en una creciente debilidad a la hora de tomar decisiones. Hablando de pérdidas de libertades, similar incógnita es la de ver hasta dónde puede llegar el abrumador control de población ejercido por China sobre sus ciudadanos, con sus sistemas de vigilancia y de crédito social. A diferencia de Occidente, ese control autoritario le sirve a China para tomar decisiones rápidas y responder a los conflictos con inmediatez. Está por ver el modo en que las relaciones de muchos países en vías de desarrollo se van a establecer con China. ¿Va a ser la nueva globalización impuesta por el gigante asiático más amable que la globalización neoliberal de la que salimos? ¿O nos vamos a encontrar con un nuevo tipo de colonialismo económico? Los nuevos poderes regionales, ¿van a aliarse entre ellos o enfrentarse? ¿Sucumbirán al avance asiático? Y sobre todo, ¿cuál va a ser la reacción del siempre poderoso Estados Unidos a la pérdida de liderazgo político y económico ante China? Nos espera un mundo más volátil. Hasta la próxima. La paz.
Bueno muchachos, estos fueron los videitos que trabajamos en esta videoclase. Espero pues que les haya parecido interesante. Ahí se muestran muchas cosas que en el encuentro sincrónico o en la clase vamos a entrar a analizar. Creo que pues esos videos dan muchas miradas, digámoslo así, muchas aristas, muchos elementos que hay que tener en cuenta para comprender no solo cómo se ha desarrollado la geopolítica internacional en las últimas décadas, sino cómo se espera que se va a desarrollar en los próximos años. Entonces, pues, no siendo más, les recuerdo nuevamente, las preguntas están aquí abajo en la descripción del video. Deben mandarme el trabajo a este correo. Y pues bueno, si no siendo más, pues me despido. Que estén muy bien.